Let's jump in this morning. We're going to find ourselves in the book of Matthew. If you're new to church, the book of Matthew is the very first book you'll come to the New Testament. The New Testament is one of two sections of the Bible. There's an Old Testament, there's a New Testament. And in that New Testament, that right there is going to chronicle what happens for us inside the life of Jesus and from thereafter. And it's important that we understand there's two different things because the Old Testament sets us up to get to Jesus. And so if you're new to the Bible and like, man, I just don't understand any of that just makes it simple. There's two parts to the Bible. The first part is what happens to get us to Jesus. And the second part of the New Testament, what happens after Jesus has gotten here. And so we're going to spend some time in the very first book of the New Testament today. It's the book of Matthew. And so Matthew writes the story. Let me give you just a little bit of background of what's happening before we dive into the story. The first one is, in our setting, I told you, if you've been here the last couple of weeks, that our entire summer series, Foundation Summer, is based upon the water. And I'm also a realist, right? I've said this multiple weeks. I know that as you're sitting in here in about 10 or 15 minutes, when the sweat just gets a bunch, you're like, man, I wish I was next to the water. So the best thing we can do is talk about the water in every single message we've got for the entire summer. That's my promise to you. There's 10 of these, and all of them happen in and around the water. This one happens to happen on a boat. And so that's what's happening here with us. Jesus and some of his best friends are going to be jumping into a boat. Well, actually, Jesus is not going to jump into the boat this time. His friends are going to jump into the boat, and they're going to go out on that very same lake or same sea we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, the Sea of Galilee. And so they're sitting there, and that's what's about to happen. This is what's going on. As I'm going to read the actual story to you. It's a pretty short little passage of Scripture from the Bible. But as we're doing that, there's a couple things I want you to try to pick out and pay attention to. For instance, if this is the very first time you've ever heard this story, if you have no idea what I'm about to read in the book of Matthew, then I want you to listen particularly to this. Know this, that what we're going to read, this has only happened to two men and the entire understanding of recorded history. Only two people have ever had this story written about them in a historical fashion. So I want you to listen to that. If you've heard this story many times, I want you specifically to hone in on how long does it take for Peter to respond. So those are your two things. If you've never heard the story before, I want you to hone in on the idea that only two men have ever been written about this happening to them in the entirety of human recorded history. If you've heard it many times, I want you to listen for how long it takes for Peter to respond. So let's jump in. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. It says this: immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. The disciples are just his closest friends. While he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And so I want to go through that story piece by piece. And there's just a few pieces that we're going to kind of look into. And as we do that, as we go through it, again, the two things are there's something that happens to only two men in recorded history in the story. The other thing is, did you pay attention to how quick or how slow one of the two, Peter, responded? The first word that jumps out to me in this passage in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, is the word immediately. I find that interesting, which it automatically tells us that something was happening before this story occurred. Like there was something happened beforehand, and then immediately something else happened. So immediately he said, "Hey, go get in the boat." And so it's important for us, if we're going to understand this piece of the Bible, to take a couple steps back and ask the question, well, what just happened to cause this immediate reaction from Jesus? And so if you were to take a look in your Bible, you actually probably have headings. I have headings in my Bible. For me, this particular heading that we're reading says Jesus walks on the water. If you were to back up a little bit in Matthew, still same chapter 14, the next heading up says Jesus feeds 5,000. And so that's the event that was happening prior. So if you're new to church, you're like, I don't know what that is. What do you mean Jesus feeds 5,000? Well, there's this particular moment where Jesus had this large number of people gathered, and they got to where it was time to eat. They still wanted to listen to him, but they had to send him home. Like, people were grumbling a little bit, like, hey, come on, I'm kind of hungry. And there was no food. Like, they were out in the middle of nowhere. There's no, like, taco shop. There's no stand. There's no hamburger place. There's no food trucks coming to save them. All they had was this small little lunch that belonged to this little boy. 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish. And he takes that. I don't want to get too much into the story, but Jesus takes it, he prays for it, and that multiplies enough to feed 5,000. The even greater miracle is most likely because we're working throughout a patriarchal society and culture in the first century church. Most likely that number of 5,000 was just the men that were there. And there were likely women and children that were not included in the count. So this could have been 10 to 15,000 people that were fed by Jesus. And so you say, well, why would that cause a reaction for Jesus to say immediately, go get in the boat? That's what's happening. So something happens, and then Jesus is like, hey, y'all got to get out of here. Go, get in the boat right now and go to the other side and wait for me. As we look in the book of Matthew, Matthew doesn't actually record what the issue is. He records there being an immediate need, but this story is actually found in multiple places throughout the Bible. There's only one author in particular that kind of talks specifically about what happens. I'll read it to you. It's in the book of John, which is just after the book of Matthew. Matthew, Mark, Luke, then John. And so when Jesus finishes doing this miracle of feeding 5,000, he says this, I'll read it to you. It says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, or the miracle, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. And when they used the word prophet there, they were talking about not like a prophet, but the prophet. So they were trying to say, hold on one second. This is the prophet we've been waiting on. Like, our entire Jewish history has pointed to a moment when this prophet would show up. And this prophet we now know to be Jesus. And they were right about that. This was Jesus. They were completely correct. However, what they wanted to do as a result of their new knowledge was not correct. It wasn't what Jesus wanted. In fact, he tells us here in verse 15, it says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, he withdrew. That's why he was so adamant about immediately go get in the boat and get out of here. You're thinking, well, hold on one second. Don't we want Jesus to be king? Right? Like, isn't that the whole point? Like, if Jesus were here today and we could hold an election and put him in the White House, isn't that probably what we'd want to do? Doesn't that make sense? And in fact, wouldn't we even say to Jesus, hold on, Jesus, you would refuse the presidency? You would refuse kingship? And Jesus said, with his actions, he's saying, maybe what's important to you isn't as important to me. He said, maybe the things that create change in your world, maybe they don't start where you think they start. Maybe he's trying to say, maybe this change that you want to see, maybe it will never come from the place you think it will come from. He says, yeah, I'm not interested in being king. And so he tells his best friends, y'all have to get out of here. And Jesus then withdraws. It was going so well, they wanted to make him king. Notice something else that happened. If you're someone who studied the Bible for quite some time, maybe you noticed and picked up a few other things in that story of the feeding of the 5,000 where he took the bread and he multiplied it. Jesus, when he was beginning his ministry, he actually ran into the desert for about 40 days, and he had a very long time of spiritual awakening, fasting. And at the end of that time, he actually has an encounter with Satan. And Satan understands that Jesus is at his weakest moment, after he's fasted for 40 days. And so he sees his opportunity and makes the decision, you know what, I want to make use of his weakest moment. And so he begins to tempt Jesus. Now, if you think Satan is not someone who prepares for his battles, for his court cases, for his arguments ahead of time, you are wrong. He has an incredible research team. He knows you up and down. He knows your ins and outs, the hot buttons that he's got to push. And the same thing with Jesus. He had been studying Jesus before the world was even made, right? Before this even happens, he is studying Jesus, trying to figure out, what is it about him? How can I catch him in this lie? How can I put him in a place where he won't succeed? And so Satan has an encounter with Jesus in the wilderness, and he chooses to tempt him 3 times with 3 different temptations. You notice here that 2 of those temptations of the 3 are there. And remember the first one, Satan says, hey, why don't you just turn that stone into bread? Jesus had just got done multiplying something that was inconsequential to a mass of 5,000 people into enough bread to feed the entire army, right? Suddenly, Satan gave us some insight that maybe Jesus has this compassionate place in him that he knows, you know, if I'm going to get at Jesus somehow, maybe I can work in from this angle. And Jesus was self-aware, and so he's sitting here going through this whole thing. He's like, you know what? I just did one of the greatest things that I do in my entire life. I took someone who had need, and I provided the need. The second way that he's tempted, or I guess it's the third way he's tempted by Satan, is Satan offers him all the power of all the kingdoms of the world. He says, look, you can be king of all this. You can have the power and rule over all of these things. And of course, Jesus refuses. Jesus understands something that's happening. Because after all, Jesus was a man. Fully God, yet fully man. The Bible tells us that he experienced every temptation that we've experienced so that he could be a better help to us in our temptation. And in this moment of the feeding of the 5,000, he meets these needs with the basic, just this basic thing of bread. And on top of that, after he's done that, he's then offered power. And he starts maybe to think back of the things that tempt him the most. And he says, you know what? I've got to do something. I'm being tempted here. So how will I respond? How do you deal with temptation when it's presented to you? What's your go-to? How do you tackle those temptation moments? I think we should take a few moments and ask the question, well, how do we dissect how Jesus dealt with those moments of temptation? The first thing we point out, and we kind of ask the question, how do you deal with temptation? Well, let's look at Jesus. The first way Jesus dealt with temptation in this moment was he did it immediately. He didn't allow the temptation to linger. He didn't allow the crowd to start saying, Jesus is king, Jesus is king, Jesus is king, did he? No, as soon as that started happening, as soon as that innuendo happened, he was like, all right, that's enough, we're done. You get out of here, and I'm going to withdraw. He says it's immediate. Dealing with temptation will require you to take immediate action. That's the best advice we got for you at the moment. You're in the middle of something right now that you've let this temptation kind of linger in and around who we are. That's where it is. You got to deal with it immediately. Jesus did. You see, the second thing he did, he removed the greatest encouragers. Fighting temptation will often require a distance from encouragers. It doesn't mean that distance has to be forever. It just means that, hey, at the end of the day, at this moment, the disciples, his best friends that he put in the boat, they were the people he was going to build the church with. They were even in on the king thing. They were even following after this thing saying, you know what, the crowd is right. You should be king. Why would we not want you to be king? Remember, the Jewish people have been in a state of oppression for quite some time under Roman rule. And so it makes sense that they would have a king that could feed the masses out of hardly anything. It makes sense that they had a king that could calm the storm. If you were here a few weeks ago, he just said one word and suddenly the storm stopped, the wind died down, the waves ceased. It makes sense that we would have a king that's that powerful. They were in on this, and Jesus said, you've got to get out of here. I can't stand around you when you're talking this foolishness. That's hard to do, though. Jesus did it with his very best friends. He said, I've got to create distance. I can't sit and listen to you encourage me to sin. I can't sit and listen to you feed my temptation. I've got to put distance. I've got to do it immediately, and I've got to put some space. The third thing Jesus did with his temptation is he went and spent time with God. He went and he got alone. You would think, hold on, how do you conclude this incredible day of feeding the masses, of teaching the masses, of allowing people to make decisions to come and have a greater understanding of who Jesus and God is? You would think that would be cause for celebration. But instead, Jesus said, you know what, this has gone a little too far, and I need to re-ground myself. I need to get back to what I am and what I'm supposed to be and who I'm supposed to be. I've got to go spend time with my Father. The truth is, dealing with temptation will require you to have honest conversations with God. You know what that conversation must have looked like when Jesus gets alone? I bet God had a little bit of, hey, I'm proud of you, son. You knew that was going to be an issue, and you immediately removed yourself from it. When I read this, it's hard for me to think in terms of Jesus fighting temptation. But at the end of the day, when I actually get to see it in black and white, it brings me a sense of relief because I can say, you know what, I do have a blueprint. That he went, he fought against the very same thing. The great thing about Jesus, he never gave in to sin. But he's honest with us in the Bible. He says, look, I've dealt with everything you've dealt with in the same way you've dealt with it, so that I have the ability to reach back into your life and deal with and help you deal with the very same temptations. For me, it's a relief to watch how he deals with this kingship that's about to happen. I love that he takes the time to talk to God and spend some time alone. He just says, hey, remind me who I am. Remind me who I'm supposed to be about. Remind me what my purpose and my mission is here on this planet. You know, that's not even really the big part of our story. I felt we couldn't ignore it as we dove into it together. You know, the big piece is that part of the storm where they're out on the boat and suddenly Jesus goes and walks to them. Did you catch the two guys, the thing that never happened to anybody else, the walking on water? Did you catch that? I don't know if I just kind of read it and you're like, oh yeah, they walked on water. No, they really walked on water. Like, I'm not talking about they walked in the water. Like, this wasn't like shallow end of a splash pad. You know what I'm saying? I mean, this is the Sea of Galilee. It's 150 feet deep. They're in the middle of the sea. Remember, it's 7 miles across, 13 miles wide. They're straight in the middle of it. And Jesus decides, hey, it's time for a stroll. I don't know if Jesus had a British accent, but if he did, it would sound good when he said it. Let's go have a stroll on the lake. I don't even know if that came across as British. I'll hear in the recording, I guess. I don't know. They're right in the middle of a storm. This seems to be a recurring theme when Jesus' close friends get in a boat. Storms come up. I think Jesus is just like a metaphor king. And it's like, hey, if they don't get it the first time I talk about my friends in a storm, maybe they'll get it with the second time I talk about them in a storm. And that's what's happening. This journey from where they were to where they're going, if you were to get in a rowboat manned by 4 people that's 26 foot long, which is typically what one of the boats in the first century would have looked like, it would have taken you with 4 strong men, which they would have been strong men because most of them are fishermen. It would have taken you about 2 hours to make this journey. They left around sunset, according to the Bible. And so it's now the middle of the night. In fact, specifically in the Greek, it tells us it's the 4th watch of the night. And we know it's the 4th watch of the night because the Bible says so. But we know what the 4th watch is because we know Roman history. They had 4 watches. The 4th watch actually was from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. That would have been the 4th watch. If you were Jewish, you only had 3 watches. But most of the Bible is written from a perspective so that other people outside the Jewish faith can understand it. And so they used the 4th watch so that all the Gentiles that read this would understand exactly when it was. Which also meant that they knew if they left at sunset the day before, 6, 7 o'clock or so, that meant that they had been rowing for over 10 hours. I mean, it's like they had a bunch of toddlers going to Disneyland. They had to stop to pee every 5 minutes. I don't know what was happening in this journey. We do know what's happening, don't we? Jesus was trying to teach them a lesson, and he said, once you've gotten so far, he called the wind and said, hey, will you just keep them there until I get there? And so they rowed, and they rowed, and they rowed, and they went nowhere. They're They're in the middle of a storm. Notice, if you were here a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the first storm, Jesus is with them in the boat, and he's asleep in the back on a cushion. And they go and run and get him, like, hey, there's a storm, and we're in trouble. Don't you care if we're going to drown? Won't you save us? And he's like, okay, goodness, you people of little faith. This time, no one's panicking. It's 10 hours into rowing, and they're just like, hey, this is just what it is. They've come to the realization that very same truth I shared with you a couple of weeks ago. Following Jesus guarantees storms. They realize this is the truth. This is just going to be our life. Jesus taught us something the first time. Jesus will teach us something this time. Wouldn't that be incredible if suddenly we had the ability to start viewing the storms in our life as opportunities to learn something new about who we are and who Jesus is? That's where the disciples had gotten. That's where Jesus' friends had finally gotten to. They said, we don't understand this. This should have taken 2 hours. It's now taken 10. We don't know what's happening, but we're just along for the ride, and we're excited to see what Jesus is about to do. They had a faith that would sustain them. They had grown in their faith. This is tangible evidence that the longer you hang out with Jesus, the better you are when you're in storms. The longer you hang out with Jesus, the better you'll be when you're in a storm. And that's where they're at. And suddenly, we actually see kind of what's happening. I forgot to mention, I think I mentioned in passing the two things. If you're a point person, you need to write them down. Storms teach us a lot about ourselves and those around us. Storms teach us a lot about Jesus. We can get to that in a second. When he's with them on the boat, or he was with them the first time, he's not with them this time. And in 14:26, one of them says, hey, it's a ghost. Here comes Jesus. That's their first thought, it's a ghost. I mean, I'll be honest with you. Yeah, they're in the mindset, I'm not scared. I'm not panicking. I don't think we're going to die. Jesus is going to teach us something. I would have never in my mind thought he's going to teach us how to walk on the water. That would have been the first thing that crossed my mind. Nor would I have thought that Jesus was going to walk on the water out to me. I've seen him do some pretty cool things. He just fed 5,000 people. That's pretty neat from a Lunchable. It took a while. But I don't think he's going to walk on the water. Yet there he is. I love that Jesus' response is, don't be afraid. You notice that it was Jesus the whole time, but they thought it was something else. And so initially their response was fear. How many times have we in life encountered a situation scared to death or furious, only to find out that it was Jesus doing so that we could learn something incredibly valuable? Jesus says, don't be afraid. I love the sequence of events. In verse 27, he says, don't be afraid. In verse 28, he says, okay, I'm not afraid. Okay, I'm not afraid. Tell me to come on out there. I love the boldness of Peter's faith. I love it. He didn't say, hey, if that's really you, fly on over here. Prove yourself, right? In fact, if you get into the original language, into the Greek in which the original language that the New Testament was written in, or this part of the New Testament was written in, if you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's not really a question when he says, if it's really you, Lord. It's a statement. It's a declaration. It's like, oh yeah, I know it's you, so if it's you, tell me to come to you. It's a bold step of faith. You notice how fast Peter responds? He says, okay, we'll come. And Peter says, all right, let me get out of the boat. Peter decided before Jesus gave the answer how he was going to react. He had spent so much time with Jesus that he had learned, if I'm given the invitation is yes. Or my response to the invitation is yes. That's an incredible place to be in your walk with Jesus, where you predetermine how you will answer him when he asks you a question. When he makes a request of you in your life, you've already decided, I know enough about Jesus. I've been around him long enough to know that the things he calls me into are good things for me. And so Peter says, hey, come on, call me out here, call me out here. I'm going. If he says yes, I'm going. Then he does. And suddenly Peter steps onto the water and history begins to record something that's only talked about by two men in the entirety of the world. And there goes Peter, walking to Jesus. In the middle of the storm, waves all around him, the wind splashing water on his forehead, and it's crazy, and he's just walking to Jesus. Isn't it interesting that sometimes for us to follow Jesus, we got to walk through a mess? For us to really get as close to him as we would like, as Peter would like, we've got to walk through a mess. You know, the story kind of starts to end where Peter takes his eyes off Jesus. In fact, it says he sees the wind and suddenly is distracted and begins to sink. He had this incredible faith for a few moments. He had predetermined how he'll respond if he received the invitation from the Son of God. And then he responded appropriately once the invitation was given. And then he made it all the way out there. In fact, we know from the story that the moment he begins to sink, Jesus immediately grabs him. And so he had made it all the way to Jesus. He was just a step away. And suddenly his faith begins to kind of go sideways. And Jesus talks to him a little bit about it. But I wonder if there's a correlation with Peter and our faith. Like maybe sometimes on Sunday mornings you come in here and immediately you said, you know what, now I know how I'm going to tackle this week. And you walk out of here like you're stepping out of the boat and stepping onto the water. And the entire week you're running, you're looking at Jesus, you're like, you know, I got this. And I'm doing something, and I'm making progress, and I'm walking to Jesus, and I got my faith with me. And then suddenly Friday night gets here, and you're like, hold on, look at the waves. You know, you get to Friday evening or Wednesday morning, whenever you begin to take your eyes off Jesus, because your weekend refill has run out or run its course. You know, the only difference between Sunday mornings and Friday nights, or Sunday morning and Wednesday evenings or Wednesday afternoons, or whenever it is your eyes wander, is just that. It's where you're looking. That's the only thing that's changed. See, Jesus never wanders off. Our eyes wander off of him. Jesus never wanders off. Our eyes wander off of him. You notice in 14, verse 30, specifically, when we look into that passage, I'm just going to read it to you. It says this. This is talking about Peter. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. Have you ever seen the wind before? We've seen the effects of the wind, haven't we? It says he saw the wind. You know, I think when we take our eyes off Jesus, we can talk ourselves into all kinds of things, can't we? You know, something I want to point out this morning is that sometimes we talk about this and Jesus being so close that he can rescue us. That Jesus rescues the lost. In fact, Jesus specifically says, I came to seek and save those who are lost. But notice, Peter wasn't someone who was lost, was he? He was a believer who was incredibly close to Jesus. And yet, even though he had one of the greatest faiths on the planet at the time, he still couldn't keep his eyes off Jesus in the middle of the greatest storm he had ever experienced, walking on water. I wonder if that's you, and you are a believer this morning, and you've been a believer for a long time, and maybe you take for granted that Jesus is always right in front of you. So much so that you said, you know what, getting out of the boat isn't all that exciting anymore. Maybe you need a new challenge. Maybe you need a new level of sacrifice. Maybe you need a new level of serving. You need something that's going to challenge your faith, that's going to scare you a bit so that you get back to focusing solely on Jesus. Walking on water must never become routine. When Jesus gets back on the boat, he pulls Peter up. They get back on the boat. They begin to worship him. I find this pretty stinking interesting that as they kind of sit and they begin to worship, I'll read this to you. Verse 32, it says, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. You know what's interesting about that is this is the first time in the first 4 books of the New Testament, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this is the very first time that they had acknowledged who Jesus really is. Prior to this, only Satan and a few demons had said this out loud. There were 14 chapters in. We're halfway through the story of the ministry of Jesus. And it's only then that the people that are close to him have the ability to make the statement that is so true. You are the Son of God. Notice that Satan and demons beat them to it. I tell you this, it's okay to be late to the Jesus party. Just don't miss it completely. And unfortunately, no one knows when the train is leaving the station. You see, Jesus wasn't upset when Satan and the demons acknowledged him as the Son of God before his closest friends. He didn't say, hey, did y'all listen to them? Were you taking notes? Did you hear what they called me? You should probably write that down. He didn't say that. And Jesus never made a big deal about it. He didn't get frustrated or angry with them. He didn't say, come on, what happens if you die tonight? Will you be with me? He didn't say any of those things. He just continued to pour into his relationship and said, hey, I hope you get it. If you get it because I force it on you, you really didn't get it. If you get it because I scare you to death with it, you really didn't get it. The only way you're going to get it is that you decide to go to the party on your own. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's halfway through his ministry. And the people that are closest to him, that watch him day in and day out, that have seen miracle after miracle, are just now getting to the place where they say, you know what? There's something special about you. And let's take it a step further. It's not that there's something special about you. I believe you are the Son of God. And so you're not going to find anybody here, if you're new to church, that says, hey, you need to jump on this Jesus thing right now. That's a decision only you can make. And it's my hope you make it on your own, in your own time. The truth is, and I said it there, unfortunately, no one does know when the train's leaving the station. I don't know when the party wagon is headed to heaven. I don't know. I have no clue. And so, yeah, it's our job to get as many people on there before it leaves as possible. Jesus already bought your ticket. But I tell you what, I'm not going and shoving it into people's faces and telling people, hey, come party with me. That's not a fun party at all. If that's you this morning and you're ready to talk a little bit more about that, we do want to invite you to it. Because sometimes someone can hand you the ticket and say, hey, Jesus bought this for you. And you say, hey, mate, I want to go. But then you're not sure how to actually get to the front door. If that's where you're at, we want to help you get to that front door. We want to help you take the ticket and make your way to the place where you can hand it over and you can walk in. That's what our church is here for. To be that facilitator, that host, that connects you with the front door of heaven. 2 weeks from now, this stage will be a little different. There'll be a feed trough that's here in the middle. If you've got cows at home, it'll look like what you feed your cows out of. If you don't have cows at home, you can go to Tractor Supply and pretend you have cows. Say, hey, if I had cows, what would I feed them out of? And they'll take you to this thing, and then you'll know what we're going to baptize people in. It'll be here on the stage. For the next 2 weeks, if that's where you're at, I'd like to invite you to make a decision. For you to honestly consider, am I ready to give my life to Jesus? If that's something you've done already as a believer, then I say the next 2 weeks on your prayer list every single day, you should be praying for those people that are trying to figure out what do they do with their ticket. That every single day you should go to God on their behalf and pray for courage and resolution. Pray for forgiveness and grace. You know, the cool thing about what happens in this story is that it's a scary moment. What I found as a follower of Jesus is that the scariest moments in our lives have the potential to lead to the greatest discoveries of our lives. At the moments where I didn't think I knew what was going to happen and I couldn't foresee how this would work or how this would fall into place, suddenly Jesus taught me, you don't need to know, and you've got to learn to be okay with it. And I've just learned to say, yes, sir. And though that fear still attempts to creep into my life, I look at other people that are friends of mine that inspire me every day with the way they live out their faith, and I'm reminded, man, it's just one step at a time. The only thing I got to remember is don't get back in the boat and don't take my eyes off Jesus. You see, we need more walking on water kind of living. We need more walking on water kind of living. And you know what that means? It means that we're admitting that we want to walk through storms. It means that we're admitting that we don't want to be in the boat. It means that we're admitting that there's potential that the waves are going to knock us to our rear end. It means that we're admitting that the wind, I can't see it, but it becomes so real it feels like I can see it. And saying, you know what, bring it, I can take it, I got shoulders strong enough to do it, I'm going to walk on water because that's where I become alive. Newnan needs more walking on water kind of living. The guys that stayed back in the boat, Jesus loved them as much. It's fine. But don't forget, only 2 guys ever walked on water. Only 2. And one of them created it. So I don't know if that counts. We need more walking on water kind of living.